Welcome to Plain Talk. Happy to be with you. Back after a break. We were on, or I was on vacation for a little while, constantly giving Oban grief about being on vacation. And for once, I was on vacation. In fairness, Chad's usually not on vacation when he's not on the show. He's actually working. I just like to say he's on vacation because it annoys it.
Yeah, well, it does annoy me, that's for sure, that just because somebody's traveling for work, they're on vacation. Rest assured, most of those travels are not vacations, but I have been vacationing quite a bit this year, and I'm not going to apologize for that.
Fair enough. A man who just won his primary and is not taking a vacation now. You see how I transition here?
It was beautiful. Beautiful work.
Is not a man who takes vacations, not during an election year. He's got an election to win. Trygve Hammer, who is now officially the Democratic NPL nominee for the United States House of Representatives. We're in the general election now. His opponent's Julie Fedorchak. Trygve, how you doing?
Hi, I'm doing great. Glad to be here. It's kind of like being with my mom and dad. Mom was a Yankees fan, and my dad was a Dodgers fan. I was growing up.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to get into the baseball talk early on the podcast. Usually we wait until the last few minutes, but
the way the Yankees have been playing, I don't really want to talk about baseball very much right now.
Did they beat the Mets last night?
They did not. Judge hit a grand slam. We got close, but they couldn't pull it out in the end because Garrett Cole, who's just back from an injury, was getting rocked, and his velocity's down, so I have a feeling he may be on his way back to the IL. So,
and Rob, I knew the answer to that question when I asked it, just so you know.
I know. You're just that kind of a person, Chad. Trygve, how's it going? The transition from primary campaign to general election campaign, what are we going to hear from you in the coming weeks?
Well, the primary campaign, we're building our war chest. We're setting the foundation still. And as far as the primary campaign goes on, that campaign was really about what I had done since 2022. I've been out to the districts. I've been out, cheerleading for the party everywhere I can, bringing people in. And we've seen results. We've seen better crowds everywhere we go. Right here in Minot, Surf Valley Dems are much more robust than we used to be. I mean, we're talking going from 4 or 5 people at a meeting to 20 to 30 people out.
Why do you think that is? What's happening?
People are just kind of emerging, I think. And I think they're seeing an opportunity now. They've seen a lot of problems in the Republican Party in North Dakota, mostly at the state level. They're a little bit fed up and they're coming back out. There was almost fear in 2020 when I was running for the state legislature. Like, Democrats said, "You've got my vote, but I don't want to sign in my yard." Yeah. And that's gone away. I think people are reemerging, and like I said, we've laid that groundwork. I was out to all the districts, so I know that most of them know me, so I wasn't worried about spending money on advertising going into the Democratic primary.
Trygve, speaking of money, Rob and I have talked quite a bit about your fundraising and that you've had quite a bit of success fundraising. Can you talk a little bit about what is different this time compared to previous races in terms of bringing in dollars, your campaign, having a campaign staff, that kind of thing?
Well, I've told people that, the difference between 2022 and 2024 is that, 2022 was amateur hour. I learned a lot. I learned a lot of the things that I did not do right. And I was determined this time that, we are going to get, the campaign staff is young, but they are experienced. They've run other campaigns. So we're bringing these people in who know how to do this stuff. And then, I'm dedicating the hours to get on the phone and call people. And, I don't think any politician likes that. I think everybody gets a little bit of imposter syndrome when they call and say, "Send me your hard-earned money." And you get past that by being, who am I? I'm the guy who's willing to run. And unless they want just the wealthy to be able to afford to run, they've got to donate. And I've got to be ready I've got to not feel bad about accepting donations.
So what's the strategy like? I mean, it's not, elections aren't won by whoever raises the most money. It's who gets the most votes on election day. So what's the strategy for turning, some of that support into votes at the ballot box?
Well, one, there's the turnout piece. There's this piece about I ran into a guy when I came out of the REC meeting here at Minot, and he said, "Hey, congratulations on the win. You got my vote in November. I wish it wasn't impossible." I'm like, it is not impossible. We can do this thing. So you got to get that turned around, and then a big part of it's name recognition. That's where that money for paid media comes in. Got to get your name out there, plus your story, who you are. People aren't going to go in and vote for somebody in this state if they don't know either of the two candidates. They're going to vote for the one with the R behind their name.
I tell you, we have some memorable names in this particular race. Trygve, Hammer, Julie Fedorchak. They stand out.
Yep. And so we know we're not going to have as much money as the other side. So we know, we've got to be judicious, and we're planning on running, just a positive campaign. I think what you saw in the primary was kind of the result, partially, of what the negativity we saw in all the advertising on the Republican side.
Trygve, one of you have a clear contrast with Julie in terms of your background. Can you talk about your experience? I mean, if you've seen any of Rob and I talked about the video you put out before the primary, which was just incredibly well done and told a great story about sort of who you're standing up for. But can you talk a little bit about your background, military, all the different things that you've done, and why that's an important voice to have in Washington that might be missing right now?
Well, I grew up in Belva. I joined the Navy out of high school. Wasn't really sure what I wanted to do, and the Navy recruiter was in at the mall when I went there. So signed that line, went off to the Navy. I was Navy nuclear power. Got into the Naval Academy. Got through my 4 years there with a degree in chemistry, and commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Marine Corps. Flew helicopters, forward air controller, infantry officer over in Iraq, which was actually maybe been the most fun I had in my military career, was that deployment to Iraq, even compared to flying helicopters in Hawaii. And then, when I did a few other things, and I come back here to North Dakota. I taught for a few years in North Dakota schools. I was surprised when I came back by how many of the schools have closed down. And, just there are a lot of changes. It's funny, you go away for, 30 years and come back, you see the things that have changed. And then I, went out and worked in the oil field because I wanted to make some good money. And, all that money is overtime. After like the third day, you're already past your 40 hours for the week. Then I was a conductor for railroad here out of Minot. And, I enjoyed that job, but the hours were crazy. You had no control of your schedule. And I knew I was going to run again. I promised I'd be back. I'd been eyeing this race. I'd had people talk to me about this race, and, I knew I was going to do it. So went over to Job Corps and took a job as career counselor there.
So
now the plan is really to go full-time campaigning.
Trygve, you have such a compelling background. We've talked a lot about this, where essentially, it's compelling. I mean, the military service, everything else. I think even the blue collar vibe, I think, really resonates with a lot of voters. Contrast that with Julie Fedorchak. I mean, obviously, there's a binary choice that voters are faced with in this race in November. Why you and not her?
I think in the Republican primary, when they had their debates, they talked a lot about experience. But I have experience that is a lot closer to most North Dakotans' regular experience. I don't travel in those moneyed circles. I have been, boots on the ground in the oil field and on the railroad. I've been around the state doing that kind of work and have had the kind of concerns that regular North Dakotans have had. In those debates, they talked about a lot of things. They never talked about access to affordable childcare, for instance. And if you travel this state and talk to people, that is something that comes up again and again and again. If you want to get more teachers, you need more childcare. My mom ran a child daycare out of our home when I was in high school, and all of her clients were teachers at the Belva High School or Belva Elementary. So, because I've been out there and I've been on the ground with regular North Dakotans, I have that experience. Plus, I have leadership experience from my time in the Marine Corps and even running a staff and training others to run a staff in when I was at Marine Corps staff training program. And so, I have the experience. I've seen it from both ends. And, in some ways I've been forced to be a jack of all trades, and in other ways it just comes kind of naturally to me.
So Trygve, obviously Julie got 47% in the primary. That means 53%, 52% voted for somebody else. I think it's no mystery that Donald Trump is probably going to do really well in the state. I mean, you're probably going to need 30% of North Dakotans to vote for Donald Trump and Trygve Hammer. How do you appeal to those folks? I mean, we talked about the bio, but are there other things that you can do that sort of, I mean, you're a Democrat running in North Dakota. You're going to have to figure out how to get Republican votes. How do you do that? How do you appeal to those folks?
What you really do is you don't pigeonhole them. You don't look at them as a monolith. And as I've been going around talking to people, it's really kind of, you might expect that all Trump supporters are the same, that all Rick Becker supporters are the same, that all Julie Fedorchak supporters are the same, but that is not true at all. I have talked to people who supported Rick Becker in the primary who said they'll never vote for a Democrat. I voted for people who supported Rick Becker in the primary who said, I've got their vote. I talked to them, Rick Becker supporters who don't like Donald Trump, and Donald Trump supporters who don't like Rick Becker, and the same thing with Julie Fedorchak. I've had Republicans tell me that and I'm sure they were in Rick Becker's camp, that they'll never vote for Julie Fedorchak. So if you look at them as a monolith, you're gonna end up treating them that way, and that shows through. You have to get out there. You have to listen. You have to understand them as individual people, and not as some homogenous whole that everybody's the same. And that's just not true. And you can feel that way when you're reading the media, when you're watching the talking heads, when you're on Facebook. But for the people that aren't there, if you get out there and actually talk to people, there's a lot of variation.
Chad pointed out that Fedorchak didn't quite get to 50% in the Republican primary, although it was a five-way primary, and I suspect a lot of those people, just because they didn't vote for Fedorchak doesn't mean they're going to cross aisles. But
Right.
When we're talking about that, I think that is a necessity. Describe the type of because I agree with you. I mean, these are, sometimes we try to use labels. The taxonomy in politics is always a challenge. Maybe now more so than ever when we're seeing realignments, we're seeing, some of the definitions of these old terms like conservative and liberal and whatnot kind of getting a little fuzzy. Describe the sort of voter that maybe is going to vote for a Donald Trump and in the past has voted for somebody like a Chad Oban or a Kevin Kramer, that you think you could turn into a Trygve Hammer voter. What does that voter look like?
Now, in a way, those voters developed in the same way as the Donald Trump voters did. We had recession in 2001. Average incomes finally recovered about 2007. And then 2008, we took another hit with the Great Recession. And then we just recover from that. And in that Great Recession, that talk of too big to fail made a lot of people feel like they were too small to matter. And it caused a lot of resentment. And on our side, a lot of these working people felt like the Democratic Party had always been there to defend them. And they felt a little bit abandoned. They felt like the Democratic Party was getting a little too close to Wall Street. And then, people are just fed up also with the money thing. I've been reading a book called The Wolves of K Street. So in the late 60s, there were 60 registered lobbyists in Washington, D.C. Now there's 117,000 in the Washington, D.C. metro area, and they're mostly representing corporate interests. And then with the Citizens United decision, what you have is also on the other end. So you have lobbyists on the back end, and then on the front end before the election, you have all this spending by the PACs in these primaries. And if you look at the Never Back Down PAC with Ron DeSantis, he had former staffers that were in that PAC. He had, close advisors and friends that were in that PAC. And he's saying, oh, there's no coordination. That would be illegal. And nobody buys that. They see all that money going in, and a lot of it gets spent on the negative stuff. If a candidate is running a, Pollyanna positive campaign, but then the PAC next to them, and they know people in that PAC is running the negative side of the campaign, there's some coordination going on.
Trygve, getting into policy a little bit, obviously the border is something that we've been talking about for, it seems like forever. What would you do about the southern border? I mean, we had a bipartisan bill that tried to get through, and then Trump sort of torpedoed it. What's the answer there? What would you do in Washington to help take care of that issue?
Well, we can get that bill through, and that bill would have done a lot of good. We do need the fentanyl detectors. We need more people processing at the border. Border encounters are way up. So that is kind of when you look at that border encounter number, that's not Border Patrol encountering people who've come across the border illegally. That's every single border encounter. Like when I would take a train across into Canada and drive the crew truck back, there would be 2 encounters involved in that transaction. So, you gotta watch which numbers you're looking at. And then there's just been a lot of messaging aimed right at the amygdala on this. A lot of, they want to make you fear. They want to make you angry. And that is not helpful. Back in 1977, I can't think of his name now, David Duke had his Klan Border Patrol. This is not a new issue. It's been going on for a long time, and there's been some ugliness in it for quite a long time. And you don't, when the enemy's at the gate, that means that your defense in depth has failed. You have not addressed the problem soon enough. There does seem to be some element of, an ounce of prevention is communism, but we can really do things that keep those people from ever making that trek up to the border. And that's where, State Department comes in. We need a better process is what it comes down to. A better process, more people doing border security, and not just on the Mexican border, also on our northern border.
The border, Chad bringing up the border issue kind of leads into a question I wanted to ask, which is, I think sometimes what hurts Democrats in North Dakota is the national Democratic brand. And I could tell you as a conservative who's been concerned about the border for a long time, I can remember when Democrats, including Democrats in North Dakota, would characterize that concern as nativism or racism or what have you. That's been really frustrating over the years, because I will completely agree that some of the people who are very concerned about the border and some of the things you're talking about it, where, it's sort of messaging that's aimed, right at the amygdala. I love that. Some of that, yes, is absolutely born of nativism. I don't disagree. But there's nothing nativist, there's nothing racist about wanting our border to be orderly and our border to be secure against people who are breaking the law, whether it's, trafficking of some sort or what have you. So how do you sort of, I don't know, like thread that needle where it's like, I'm a Democrat who's going to take border security seriously? Because, and even though, Republicans have a lot, Donald Trump killing that bipartisan border bill, I think undermined their credibility on the issue a lot. But, I think there's a lot of, North Dakota voters who are like, do Democrats have credibility on the border issue when they've been calling us racists all these years because we want to secure the border? How do you overcome that?
Well, we absolutely have to secure the border. And I've actually seen that done. We had to do that. It was a very problematic thing over in Iraq. I was in Wazir province, which was on the border with Iran, and we had people infiltrating all the time and had to gather them up, and we didn't have that many people to do it with. So, definitely you need to secure the border. And when it comes to the messaging, we have a perception problem, and we know that, and that's part of what this campaign, we got to battle some of those perceptions. Some of them are from Republican messaging that's been very effective, and then some of them are self-inflicted wounds. Like you look at defund the police, for instance. Like you could not have thought of a worse slogan. And when you look at the numbers, blue states actually fund law enforcement. They have 33% higher funding of law enforcement than red states per capita. So defund the police makes it look like you would expect that, they're starving for money in police forces in those blue states, but exactly the opposite is true. It almost looks like we in the red states need to start beefing up our police a little bit. But that perception remains, and it comes from our own word. Well, people on the left, their words, and they were well-meaning, and they tried to say that we were really talking about we need to move some of these things to social services and better things for mental health. But when you put that out there, the defund the police, that's what everybody hears, and that's what you hear back. And now I got a perception that we have to battle. And the same thing.
Oh, go ahead.
And the same thing with the labels you were talking about earlier. I think I told the story to you about my grandfather's campaign card that said, vote for these 3 progressive Republican men. Well, I don't think there's very many progressive Republican men left, but when my grandfather switched from Republican NPL to Democratic NPL, same guy, same beliefs, really kind of for the same policies, but switching from that Republican label to the Democratic label, he didn't win that next election. And there are people they're never going to vote for a Democrat. We realize that. They still need to be heard, but we have to go for those who are persuadable. And those labels just don't mean a whole lot to me.
Trygve, one of the things that I don't think that we talk enough about is sort of the things that are happening around the world, the conflicts happening around the world. I mean, we've got obviously Ukraine and Russia. It's been befuddling to me that it's often conservatives who are siding more with Russia than Ukraine. Obviously, we have Israel and Gaza. Can you talk a little bit about what your approach would be to these really, really big conflicts that are going on in the world as a member of Congress and as North Dakota's only voice in that chamber?
Yeah, when I look at what's happening in Ukraine, I feel kind of more like a Reagan Republican than a lot of the Republicans out there. We are defenders of democracy, but even more right now, we're defending anyone from authoritarians. And you're seeing this authoritarian messaging get through everywhere. And I understand having been to Iraq and looked around and thought, this is going to take a generation to make this right. And we really don't understand the human terrain here. It just really felt like that. And I think a lot of people who've served in Iraq and Afghanistan kind of came away with that feeling, and they, along with many others, are hesitant about getting into any other kind of foreign conflicts. But Putin has to be stopped. Putin's a butcher, and we need to stop him. You hear this. I understand how people feel about money being sent overseas, but really we are leveraging another nation's army to fight someone who is definitely our enemy. And so it really is good bang for the buck. Other thing you hear is, well, Ukraine's all, they've got a lot of, you can't trust them. But that's also coming from Putin's machine, that saying that Ukraine is corrupt. If you want to see Ukraine corrupt, you got to go back to Yanukovych, who was Putin's puppet over there in Ukraine. He stole millions from the people of Ukraine and now lives in Russia. He's the guy who had Paul Manafort working for him. It's like, Paul Manafort seems to have a type. He wants to be around these people with money and power.
That would be former Trump campaign manager, advisor, Paul Manafort. And you're right. I mean, it is funny. Ukraine does have corruption problems, and a lot of those corruption problems has its roots in the Putin puppet regime that preceded the current leadership in Ukraine. What about Israel-Palestine? What are your feelings there? That's a very ugly situation. I think nobody wants the bloodshed happening, but on the other hand, it's Israel and Palestine, right? It's intractable. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, it really does seem intractable, doesn't it? This has been going on since when I was a kid or even before. When we went to Iraq and we were out on the street, we when the shooting started, you had to clear between and beyond. And it's not easy when the bad guys they're not worried about civilian casualties. They're not worried about anything. But and that's what really takes courage. You have to, you look down, sight alignment, sight picture, and who's between, who's behind. And that all happens very quickly with training, but it also makes the job a lot harder. I think Israel, obviously, they deserve to defend themselves. The attack on October 7th was brutal. They deserve our support in defending themselves. However, they should have that same attitude that we had about you go in there and you do it the right way. And the right way is going to be very dangerous. The right way is going to be very hard, but the right way is also going to spare the lives of civilians. And in a way, I feel like Netanyahu needs Hamas and Hamas needs Netanyahu. Netanyahu was in a lot of trouble before that October 7th attack. There were a lot of corruption going on, and it looked like he probably wouldn't be in control of the government for much longer. And now he is. And Hamas counts on a hardliner response. If a terrorist can get there, if they can poke you with the stick and then you come in and carpet bomb, they've actually won. They're winning the battle further down the road. You don't want a response that's going to just create more terrorists and make you look bad in the eyes of the world.
We have just a couple minutes left. One thing I wanted to ask you before we ended up, we kind of touched on the ugliness in the Republican primary on the Republican side of this House race. One of the things in there were the text messages, and that's been kind of a continuing issue because there's been complaints filed. I've heard that the FBI is involved in investigating, which wouldn't surprise me since we're talking about A, a federal race, and B, potential fraud that took place over the telephones. You were mixed up in that as well. When I say mixed up, in that some of the fraudulent text messages that went out had your name and your picture and were trying to say, trying to articulate an argument that, vote for Rick Becker because that's who Trygve Hammer wants you to vote for, or something like kind of aimed, I guess, at Democratic voters, getting them to cross over and vote for Rick Becker. Have you been involved at all in that complaint process or that investigation process, or what's been your reaction or your response to that?
Yeah, I kind of use the Colin Powell response: get mad and then get over it. And we realized we didn't have a lot of energy or resources to spend on it, and angry that they used one of them they used my photo, they used our logo. And they said these things. And the funny thing is they were actually, I would say, counterproductive. I guess it depends on who put them out there. But if anything, they probably drove voters to Julie Fedorchak, because if you're going to vote in the Republican primary and you hear that the Democratic candidate wants you to vote for Rick Becker,
as a tactic, I don't think the whole thing worked well at all. I mean,
it's a desperate candidate who was throwing stuff at the wall, and it was embarrassing and unethical.
Yeah. So, we decided finally it's just, that's a Republican primary thing right now. We think it's not going to happen again. I'm glad to hear it's being investigated thoroughly or with some rigor, and we should be able to get an answer pretty fast. I can't imagine that it's that complicated to find out who funded those things, because we do fundraising text messages, and they come from certain numbers, and those numbers you can look at who owned them at the time, and you should be able to draw that line fairly quickly.
Yeah, I would think there's got to be a digital trail, but what do I know? I'm a columnist and a podcast host, not an investigator. Hopefully they get to the bottom, because whoever was responsible for that deserves to be held accountable, because that was, I think everybody can agree across party lines, that was wrong. Trygve, thank you so much for your time.
Oh, good to be here. It actually went really fast, so that's usually a good sign.
Well, if only, Trygve, there were some big issues you had to deal with in this congressional race between Ukraine, Russia, Gaza, the border. We didn't even get to talk about national abortion bans, so maybe next time.
Real quick, would you? I guess we real quick, would you support that or even any sort of? I mean, I think we always put it in the context of a ban. I'm more interested. Is this a state's issue? I mean, should the federal government codify Roe, or should it put in place a ban, or should it just stay out of it and leave it to the states?
Well, right now, the Supreme Court says it belongs to the states. And then when Clarence Thomas wrote about it in his concurring opinion, he said, yeah, we also ought to look at, gay marriage. We ought to look at, birth control. So it's a sticky subject. I don't believe in a national ban, especially like if it were to be like a 6-week national ban. That is not productive at all. I really think comes down to local control. And I think that local control is between that woman trying to make a decision and her doctor. And what we haven't seen since that Dobbs decision is a rush to create a safety net for expectant mothers and infants. We've seen the race to 6 weeks. We've seen laws to, you can't cross this part of Texas on your way to get an abortion. If you're a doctor in Texas and someone thinks you did that abortion before the mother was close enough to death, well, that person can get $10,000 for reporting you, and then you can be in legal trouble as that doctor. That is definitely not the direction we expected to go. And now we're starting to see IV in vitro fertilization being challenged. Southern Baptist Conference just came out against in vitro fertilization when, after the Roe decision, the Southern Baptist Conference said, this is okay. This was a good decision. The theology hasn't changed. It's the politics that have changed. And nobody wants more abortions.
I just did I did to you the thing that I used to do on radio all the time, right? It's like, we got a commercial coming, break up in 30 seconds. Give me this answer to this hugely complex policy question in 30 seconds. So I think we gave you enough time. We do got to roll because we got another guest coming up. Thank you, Trygve, so much for your time.
Great. Thank you for having me, Mom and Dad.
The cold cases you see at the Vault have captivated readers across our region for years. At the Vault podcast, our team of professional reporters takes you further into those stories with new interviews from family members, investigators, and experts. Check out The Vault at inforum.com/The Vault and subscribe to The Vault wherever you find your podcasts.
Just finished up our interview with Trygve Hammer. Now we're going to move on. I think that this week we're probably going to see, and I don't know, maybe by the time you listen to this podcast, the signatures will have been turned in for a ballot measure that is aimed at eliminating, and I want to be very clear about this because it's put in the context that it's going to eliminate property taxes, but it really doesn't. It eliminates a very specific type of property tax, which is essentially an ad valorem tax, a tax on the property, on the value of real property and personal property. What it doesn't do is prevent governments, local governments, from putting a tax on, say, the square footage of your property, or saying you have to pay a tax on every four-wheeler that you own, or every boat that you own, or every recreational vehicle that you own. Those sorts of property taxes would still very much be allowed, but the tax on the value of your property, that would be prohibited. And I think that's an important distinction because it says the title of the campaign is End Unfair Property Tax. It really doesn't end property taxes, just the specific type that we have right now. Although there may be a lot of people listening about this who are upset about their property tax bill, as I am, who would be fine with that. But we're going to have a discussion about that. A coalition with a familiar name has launched against this, and actually Chad Oban, my co-host, is a part of that coalition, a leader in that coalition. So this is going to be a little bit strange segment where I'm going to be interviewing Chad along with Andrea Pfennig, who is the Director of Government Affairs for the Greater North Dakota Chamber of Commerce. Andrea, how are you?
Good, thank you.
Chad, how you doing, pal?
I'm still good. I mean, I feel like we just talked for the last 30 minutes, but
right.
Yeah, I'm good.
That's right. So first of all, Andrea, tell me about this coalition. It's called Keep It Local again. That was the name last time that a similar proposal was on the measure, was on the ballot. The Keep It Local coalition, what's this all about, Andrea?
So the coalition is a wide variety of stakeholders. Right now, I think we're up to 64 different members. And really, you see a lot of different interests that are represented. We have business groups, not only Greater North Dakota Chamber, but a lot of local chambers across the state have signed on to the coalition. We have agricultural groups like North Dakota Farmers Union, energy groups, Lignite, Petroleum Council, RECs, education groups, healthcare, organizations that represent the elderly, and the list goes on.
Chad, the size of that coalition, I think is really says something, because it represents. I'm trying to think when I was looking down the list of the dozens of organizations. I'm trying to think, is there anybody in North Dakota who doesn't belong to at least one of these groups?
Yeah, when we add up the number of people who are represented by these groups, I think it's now up to 240,000 people. And obviously there's some duplication, but these groups came together, and it's an ideologically diverse group, right? It's sort of fun to think about, this group of groups coming together who often are adversarial on policy or don't work in the same area, that are really coming together because they care about their communities. And they know that, as you wrote about in your column today, the proponents of this thing are basically saying, hey, we're just going to make up $1.3 billion a year with talking points and hopes. And I think you called it a fairy tale, Rob, and I think that's exactly right. There's no plan. There's no plan to fill this in. And so I think these groups coming together, it's because they understand that this is not the right solution, but at the same time understand that people are mad about property taxes, and there's a message that's being sent here that something has to be done more formal than maybe has been done in previous sessions.
One of the things, Andrea, that I would think that you guys are up against is that angst about property taxes, which is widespread and very, very real. People are upset about it, and they've heard a lot. After the 2012 end property tax ballot measure, they were told, they were made a lot of promises saying, the legislature is going to look at this, we're going to fix this. We're more than a decade later now, and I don't think anybody feels like the property tax problem has been fixed. What's your message, I think, to the sort of voter who's out there saying, listen, I voted against it last time, fool me once, if they're not going to fix it, we got to do something extreme. How do you reach those voters? How do you persuade them?
Well, I think it's important to keep in mind that, people care about property taxes, and we know that. And we know that people are frustrated with property taxes. However, this isn't the answer for it. And on top of that, if you're frustrated by the lack of action in what the state legislature has done, I don't know, with all respect to all the state legislators, I don't know that going back to the state legislature and putting all of the decisions in their hand is the answer for that. I would also say to those people that are frustrated with their property taxes, talk to your local leaders, the people in your city councils and your county commissions. Those are your neighbors. They're living in your communities, and they care about those property taxes as well. Use those people and give them your feedback.
Yeah, and I think Andrea is absolutely right there. I think it's important for folks to understand. You talk to county commissioners, and I think on average, just a handful of people that go in and talk to their county commissioner frustrated about their assessment. But the other thing that I would suggest is that there are state programs that are put in place that are underutilized around homestead tax credit for elderly folks, the primary residency tax credit. There are things that I think are underutilized that the legislature has tried to do, but maybe isn't doing an effective job of making sure folks know about it. So I think that's one of the first steps. But also, to Andrea's point, you got to talk to people. You can't just complain, and then all of a sudden you have this big, huge hammer to eliminate $1.3 billion with no plan to replace it, and think that our emergency services and schools and everything is just going to function the same because the proponents of this say there's plenty of ways to cut.
It is interesting because we talk rightly about the widespread consternation about property taxes, and it's perpetually a top issue, one election cycle after another. But then you juxtapose that with the turnout at park board meetings or school board meetings. And sometimes, yes, there will be a lot of people at meetings like that. They're usually not there to talk about the property tax, though. I mean, if there's a lot of people there to hoot and holler at a school board meeting about, books in the library or something. But usually the people who are upset about the property taxes aren't turning up to those meetings. So that really seems like a disconnect, Chad, where, and in some ways, I guess I feel like that's why part of why the legislature has struggled with this issue is that it's not really a state issue. That's always been my argument.
Yeah, and it's hard too, because I also think taxpayers are frustrated. They don't know who to turn to, right? They go to their local political subs and they say, well, the legislature is not doing enough to support infrastructure or schools or whatever it is. They go to the legislature and they say, well, your spending at the local political subs is out of control. But again, I think that the idea that the legislature has been terrible at taking care of property taxes, so let's put $1.3 billion of decisions into their hands, doesn't make sense. And Andrea, I don't know if you have the numbers in front of you, but the $1.3 billion represents a huge percentage of the state general fund budget.
That's per year or per biennium?
That's per year, according to the Legislative Council.
So
1.3 billion. Yeah,
2.6 billion per legislative session, really.
Yeah. And Andrew, what percentage of the general fund budget is that?
40.4%.
And you think about that, 40.4% of the general fund budget that they're going to have to just find.
There's going to be new taxes. There's going to have to be some new tax. Like either an existing tax is going to go up, or they're going to find new taxes. Like a tax on and continue to tax property, maybe just in a different way. I don't know what they're going to come up with, but we're not just going to find that in a mattress somewhere in the Capitol building.
Well, I think that's part of our members' concerns, Rob, is that what will that look like? Right. We don't know what that's going to look like, and we don't know how that's going to impact businesses as we move forward.
Well, yeah, thinking about some of the members of your coalition, if you're the North Dakota Chamber of Commerce, maybe that means sales tax hikes to you, and you're concerned about that. If you're the oil industry, maybe that means higher taxes on extraction and production. If you're the agriculture industry, maybe it means a higher tax on fuel. We don't know how these things are going to manifest themselves. Or maybe, by the way, some of the exemptions that the agriculture industry enjoys for property taxes now, maybe those will go away and we'll see some new tax. I don't know how it would manifest itself, but yet that's part of the problem is we're just going to get away, and then we're going to drop it in the legislature's lap and say, okay, find the money.
Well, yeah, find the money, or say, hey, local communities, figure it out. And if you're a rural community without a sales tax base, and only a Cenex store, it's hard to fund your schools, your local infrastructure, your emergency services based on a sales tax increase in communities that don't have a sales tax base. I think that's very, very concerning. I also think, Lignite, Jason Bohr was part of the press conference to announce this coalition. He talked about if you go into coal country and you go into those communities, they're great, great communities. And it's because those local communities decided to invest in their communities, right? It's not going to Bismarck and asking Fargo legislators to decide what Hazen needs. There's some, control your own destiny in your neighborhood. If Bismarck needs a new school, if Bismarck wants to build a new athletic facility, it seems to me that, as a taxpayer in Bismarck, that maybe I should determine if I've got skin in the game or not, if that's something that's important.
Andrea, that is something I like. I worry sometimes that it's very easy to say, well, I'll get rid of the tax on me and we'll put it on those other people over there, not realizing if we raise taxes on businesses or industries, that's still going to trickle down to me, right? Whether I'm paying higher prices for goods and services or what have you. I am really worried about abolishing property taxes and creating another barrier or I guess maybe another layer of separation between taxpayers and the cost of their government. Because sometimes listen, I get it. The tax bill, I'm not having a lot of fun when that shows up in my mailbox either. But I do appreciate that I'm essentially getting an invoice for government and I'm understanding what it's costing me. And I feel like that connection is important.
I think you're right. And I think that there's another aspect that we need to consider in the fact that this is a constitutional measure. And so once that's in, it's really difficult to make changes, and it's really difficult to adapt and adjust and respond to fluctuating market conditions. And so I think that's something that North Dakotans need to consider. But I also think that North Dakotans are smart enough to know that you get what you pay for, right? And so you're not going to get the services, whether you're living in rural North Dakota or urban North Dakota, you're not going to get the services that you want in your community without paying for them.
You know, one of the things in the last legislative session, and it's not really related to this, but I ended up doing a lot of work with an ambulance service out in, it was the Killdeer area. But I mean, they don't just cover Killdeer, they cover probably a size and area of Western North Dakota that's about the size of Rhode Island. And they're funded by, at least in part, by a property tax, a mill levy. And they, you know, at the time they wanted to increase the mill levy, and that was decided by local voters. But I don't think people understand how many of those services really are driven locally, and how difficult it might be. And don't get me wrong, I mean, I don't want to demonize the legislature here, but you know, I think it might be hard for somebody in Minot to understand what Killdeer needs, or somebody in Fargo to understand what Crosby needs. That's a difficult thing, and there's a reason why we've structured our government this way, so that we can keep things local.
Rob, I don't think the legislature, they obviously don't want this. So I don't think it's demonizing the legislature. I think they know their limitations. Yeah. And another thing that I think about is libraries. I mean, libraries are funded through mills in a matching program with the state. We saw last session, a lot of legislators very concerned on what's happening in libraries. Do they cut funding to local libraries if, you know, they find a book they don't like or something like that? Again, you know, having local communities control their own destiny is super, super important here. And again, there's no plan. I mean, it's sort of like, you know, if there's an alternative for the library to stay open or the Killdeer EMS to stay open, there's no plan. There's no alternative to this funding source. It's just poof, $1.3 billion are gone annually.
Chad, what do you think of the timing, the fact that, I mean, I guess I don't, what is their deadline? When did they have to have the Saturday. Do you make anything out of the fact that it took them right up to the deadline to get their signatures?
So all indications are they're going to turn them in on Friday. I'm really interested to see what their number is because they're using a full 12 months. And, you know, there's rumors around that they're not going to have a lot of cushion in the number of signatures they've gathered. Rick Becker was on the radio, I think, last week talking about how hard it is to get volunteers to collect signatures for these kind of things. I think it is like an issue like this that should be really easy for voters to understand that they're struggling to get signatures. Maybe I would read something into it. I mean, I suppose it doesn't matter if they have a cushion of 200 votes or 200 signatures or 20,000 signatures, but they're using every second of the 12 months to get it done. I told somebody yesterday, I remember the first time I saw a signature gatherer was at the July 4th parade in Mandan. Rick Becker was collecting signatures. It feels like a lifetime ago, last July 4th. So I don't know. And I do think that North Dakotans are pretty smart. They'll figure out that if something sounds too good to be true, it usually is. So I think we're feeling pretty good about things. I mean, when you have the business community, coal, oil, the AFL-CIO, AARP, all these groups coming together saying this doesn't make sense.
It's some strange bedfellows there as well. I mean, you have the labor people and the business people. You have, I mean, not that anybody on either side of that debate's bad people, but they don't usually work together.
Yeah,
you normally will find us on some opposite sides when it comes to certain issues. That's for sure.
Yeah. So how do we, in terms of voters? Again, I think what really when I'm thinking back to 2012, and by the way, I have to out myself. I was in favor of abolishing property taxes in 2012, and I came around, and the part of the reason I came around on this is the argument that, what do you replace it with? Like I was so angry, and again, I think I was justified in my anger for what was happening to us on property taxes, and also justified in, you know, looking around and thinking, well, if I you know, one day when I'm a retiree and my income is fixed and my property taxes keep going up and I get forced out of my house, things like that upset me. I find that upsetting. I understand why people are angry about this. But it seems, Andrea, that the number one rebuttal to that is, okay, show us something better. And that's really what the abolish... I want to put it this way. I would be in favor of abolishing property taxes if somebody could show me an alternative that would work. I would be in favor of it. I just don't know what that alternative is. And I really think, Andrea, that's the problem the campaign behind this has.
I'll tell you that a lot of my members had concerns about the fact that there is no plan for implementing this as we move forward. So yes, it's a huge price tag. And on top of that, the policies to implement it aren't there. There's a lot of century code changes that would need to be made. And again, you need to have a plan. No plan is a bad plan. This is a shelving.
And Andrew's right about, the legislature will spend the whole next session trying to figure out how to implement this thing rather than looking at all the other issues that the state of North Dakota needs to be working on. And again, property taxes, I think about that, this is my real world, the funding formula for K through 12 education is so dependent on what local schools are levying for property taxes. You'd have to write the whole mechanism for funding schools in a completely different way. The no plan. There is no plan to replace $1.3 billion.
Well, also let's think about it logistically as well. The legislature meets once every 2 years, and yes, they could be called back into special session, but A, that doesn't happen very often, and B, it's really expensive to call them back into special session. Guess who meets all the time? County commissions and school boards and park boards. They meet year round. I don't, there's nothing better. It's sometimes, I think the way to describe this sometimes is maybe out of the frying pan into the fire. Because I don't know that this is going to take us in a direction that is going to improve things. Andrea, real quick, where do people go if they want for the Keep It Local campaign? Is there like a website or a central place to go if they want to keep up on news about this?
KeepItLocalND.com.
KeepItLocalND.com, and I assume there's social media profiles and everything people can find there.
Andrea, I think it's .org.
It's org, excuse me.
.org. Okay. KeepItLocal.org.
Hey, Rob, can I switch to the interviewee or interviewer now?
Yeah, if you want. Yeah, go ahead.
So, Andrea, I've got a question for you about, now it feels like I'm about to drop a gotcha question on you, but I'm not going to. One thing that I often hear about business is sort of you want certainty, right? What happens if this thing passes in terms of local businesses and the uncertainty around how their taxes will work? How will local businesses handle that?
Well, I think that one thing that you see when businesses don't have certainty is that there's a lot less willingness for an investment. So they might pause some of their actions to see what's going to happen as the state develops its plan moving forward, because they're going to need to adapt.
One thing too, Chad, is that the legacy fund gets thrown around a lot because it's this big pot of money that's sitting out there that we haven't really defined a lot of purposes from. I think that there is an effort, because I hear Rick Becker talk about this sometimes, and there's an effort to lead people into thinking that, we have the legacy fund, that'll just take care of it. Well, the legacy fund, I guess, what's the response to that? This idea that we...
The response is, Rob, the legacy... Oh, Andrew, do you want to... Look, Andrew really wants to respond to that. Will you go ahead?
Yeah, I would. When you think about the balance of the legacy fund, you're at $10 billion. And so when you think about $2.6 billion per biennium, that's going to eat that up really, really fast.
Yeah. And that $10 billion is not kicking off anything like I wish it was kicking off $2.6 billion in earnings a biennium, but it's nothing even close to that. I am not smart enough at math to even try to predict the sort of balance we would need for it to produce $2.6 billion in revenue on its own every biennium so that we could replace the property taxes. The legacy fund is not a silver bullet that's going to solve this problem.
Well, and Rob, the other thing I'd say, I've seen a list from the proponents of state government programs that should be cut. The vast majority of them are one-time spending sort of things. But there's many of the others that are like the state investment in human services at the local level. That was meant to bring down property taxes. That all these different programs that are meant to bring down property taxes. If the state cuts that, it'll just be a bigger bill for local political subs to pick up. So again, it's not well thought out. And you can say, there's too much government. We should cut $1.3 billion a year. When we're talking about cutting 40 some odd % of the general fund budget, it's not that easy.
Yeah, everybody's for spending cuts until you start putting together the list of things that are going to have to be cut.
Well, and now we got to disagree on what should be cut.
Sure.
But I think the three of us would have a tough time coming up with $1.3 billion of state cuts.
The state of North Dakota, whatever else you want to say, pretty frugal, really.
Yeah, I was just going to add that some of the things that have been suggested to be cut are things like economic development programs and workforce programs that are really important to our members. I mean, when you think about one of the top public policy issues facing North Dakota, 58% of our members will say it's workforce.
Yeah.
We need more workers.
Yeah.
If we want to grow our economy, we need more workers.
So we
can grow our businesses.
We cut some of those things, and now what? Like we cut spending on human services. We still got a child care shortage, right? We still have a mental health crisis in our state. What now? We're gonna abandon the things we're doing now.
The workforce piece is a perfect example of the short-sightedness of this. So we don't have workforce, so our businesses can't grow. We lower our tax base moving forward, and all of our other taxes go up, right? I mean, there's a reason why these programs are invested in. It's to diversify the economy, to increase the tax base.
I mean, listen, there's always some fat on the bone that could be cut, but it's not $2.6 billion a budget cycle worth of fat that's on the bone that could be cut. Eventually, this is not going to reduce your property taxes, or this isn't going to reduce, I should say, it's not going to reduce your tax burden. What it is it's going to push a lot of spending into other avenues for raising revenue. Your vehicle registrations might get more expensive. We might start looking at something like a local income tax. That's something they do in other parts of the country where your city also levies a tax on your income. Do you want that? I don't know. I mean, listen, the ways that the government has available to it to raise revenue are almost limitless. And if you think by eliminating this one very specific type of tax is just going to make that tax burden evaporate into the ether, that's why I call it a fairy tale. You are kidding yourself. They're still going to get the money out of you. They're just going to do it in ways that are probably going to be A, less transparent, and B, probably less pleasant. So, not that the property tax is pleasant. Again, don't get me wrong. Well, I think that's all we got time for, though. I really appreciate you coming on, Andrea and Chad. I appreciate you being a guest on the show for a moment.
I gotta be honest. It is more fun to be the person asking the questions than answering the questions.
Yeah.
But I gotta tell you, Rob, while you were on vacation last week, I wasn't getting enough ability to have people listen to me. That's why we did the press conferences last week.
That's why I did it while I was on break. Yeah, so you could get your little boost of attention.
A little spotlight on Chad Oban never hurts anybody. Actually, might hurt society.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Andrew.